You're about to witness something that shouldn't have been possible. One pilot, one radar operator. 12 Japanese bombers carving through pitch-black skies, no moon, no stars. Just instruments glowing faintly in a cramped cockpit and the certainty that if even one bomber slips through, hundreds of American soldiers sleeping in tents below will die before dawn. Major Carroll C. Smith understood the mathematics instantly. 12 targets, 3 hours of fuel, 10 minutes per intercept if everything went perfectly. Which meant he could destroy 3, maybe 4 bombers before his tanks ran dry. The other 8 would complete their mission. Engineers would die, construction crews would burn. The invasion schedule would collapse. And all those calculations assumed that nothing went wrong. Something always went wrong. The date was December 29, 1944. The location was Mindoro, a jagged volcanic island in the northern Philippines that most Americans had never heard of but would determine whether the invasion of Luzon succeeded or became a bloodbath. Smith sat at McGuire Field in the cockpit of his Northrop P-6-1 Black Widow, watching his radar operator track a contact moving at 180 knots through darkness so absolute it felt like drowning in ink. Smith was 26 years old. He'd flown 43 combat missions. For confirmed kills already marked his record. Tonight would either make him the top American night fighter ace of the entire war or add his name to the list of pilots who burned into the Pacific Ocean without anyone knowing exactly where or why. His radar operator, Lieutenant Philip Porter, sat in a separate compartment behind the cockpit, eyes locked on a glowing green scope that showed every aircraft within 5 miles. Porter had been tracking targets for 6 months. He knew how to read the scope's language, the way contacts moved, the patterns that separated friendly aircraft from enemy bombers, the subtle differences between a pilot flying a search pattern and one committed to an attack run. But knowing didn't change the fundamental problem: 1 P-61, 12 bombers. The mathematics remained brutal no matter how skilled they were. For 2 weeks, Japanese bombers had attacked Mindoro every single night. 334 air raid alerts in 14 days. The pattern had become predictable in its relentlessness. Sunset brought the first wave, midnight brought another. 3 in the morning, more bombers. The Japanese understood exactly what American engineers were building on Mindoro 2 operational airfields that would put American fighters within range of the entire Lingayen Gulf invasion force. Those airfields represented the difference between a successful landing and a disaster. If American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolt could operate from Mindoro, they could provide continuous air cover over the invasion beaches. Without those airfields, the landing force would be vulnerable to Japanese air attacks throughout the most critical hours of the assault. Ships would burn, landing craft would sink. The invasion would fail. The Japanese had to stop construction. They sent everything they could spare: conventional bombers, kamikazes, anything capable of carrying explosives and reaching Mindoro before fuel ran out. Most nights, the bombers got through. Bombs cratered runways under construction. Engineers died in their tents. Construction equipment burned. Every attack set the airfield completion schedule back by days. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had arrived at Mindoro on December 26, 3 days before Smith's mission. The squadron was the only thing standing between Japanese bombers and 20,000 American troops sleeping in canvas tents scattered across the airfield perimeter. The pressure was crushing. Every bomber that penetrated American defenses meant casualties, delays, setbacks that rippled forward through the entire invasion timeline. Smith's P-61 Black Widow was different from anything the Japanese had encountered before. The Northrop design team had created the first American aircraft built specifically for night combat. 66-foot wingspan, twin Pratt and Whitney R2800 engines producing 2,000 horsepower each. Maximum speed 366 miles per hour. For 20mm Hispano M2 cannons mounted in the belly. But the real weapon wasn't the cannons, it was the SCR-720 radar mounted in the nose. The radar could detect aircraft up to 5 miles away in complete darkness The Japanese had no equivalent technology. Their bombers flew at night because darkness made them invisible to conventional fighters. American pilots couldn't see targets they couldn't visually acquire. Engaging enemy aircraft at night was considered nearly impossible with standard equipment. The P-61 changed everything. Japanese bomber crews flew through darkness believing they were safe. They maintained steady courses. They didn't take evasive action. Why would they? No American fighter could find them in pitch-black skies. They were catastrophically wrong. The radar system worked through a rotating parabolic dish that sent microwave pulses forward in a 180-degree arc. When those pulses struck an aircraft, they reflected back. Porter's scope displayed the return as a glowing blip on a circular screen. Two displays showed azimuth and elevation left or right, above or below the P-61's flight path. Porter guided Smith toward contacts using verbal corrections transmitted through the intercom. Left 5 degrees, down 3 degrees. Range for miles, the system required absolute coordination between pilot and radar operator. Smith flew blind, trusting Porter's instructions completely. Porter read the scope, interpreting blips and returns that meant nothing to untrained eyes. When the target got close enough, Smith could track it on his own simplified radar display integrated into the main instrument panel. The pilot scope showed range and relative positioning, enough information for Smith to close within firing range without relying entirely on verbal instructions, but radar alone wasn't sufficient. Night fighting remained the most dangerous form of aerial combat, even with technological advantages, no horizon, no visual references. Just instruments, radar returns, and the constant awareness that the target being tracked might be friendly. Misidentification killed pilots as efficiently as enemy fire. Smith had trained for 18 months specifically for night combat, Orlando Army Airfield in Florida. Radar intercept procedures, night navigation. Gunnery practice in total darkness. The training was exhaustive because the margin for error was microscopic. One mistake misreading the radar, misjudging altitude, firing at a friendly aircraft and the pilot died or killed fellow Americans. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron had flown its first combat mission in November 1943, operating from primitive airstrips in New Guinea. They'd started with P-70 Havocs, then modified P-38 Lightnings with experimental radar systems that barely functioned. The P-61s arrived in September 1944. The Black Widow was everything earlier night fighters weren't: stable, forgiving, powerful. The radar actually worked consistently. Pilots could trust their instruments. But instruments couldn't solve Smith's problem tonight. 12 bombers were inbound. His fuel would last approximately 3 hours. 10 minutes per intercept meant he could engage 3 targets before returning to base. 9 bombers would reach Mindoro unopposed. 9 bombers meant hundreds of casualties, possibly thousands if they struck fuel dumps or ammunition storage areas. The mathematics were unforgiving. Most night fighter missions ended without contact despite radar assistance. The sky was enormous. Even with technology that let pilots see in darkness, finding a single bomber required perfect coordination, patience, and substantial luck. Finding 12 bombers in one night seemed impossible. The entire 418th Night Fighter Squadron had scored 18 kills since arriving in the Pacific Theater 14 months earlier. 18 confirmed victories in over a year of operations. Smith already had 4 kills to his name. Adding more tonight would move him up the scoring list. But records were meaningless. Statistics didn't matter. What mattered was stopping those bombers before they dropped their ordnance on American personnel who had no shelters, no protection, nothing except canvas tents and the hope that night fighters would intercept threats before bombs started falling. Porter's voice crackled through the intercom. Contact, heading 035, altitude 8,000 feet. Range for miles. Smith pushed the throttles forward. The twin R2800 engines responded instantly with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat. The Black Widow climbed at 2,000 feet per minute, clawing toward altitude where the first target maintained its steady course toward Mindoro. Smith couldn't see anything through the canopy. Just absolute blackness. No moon penetrated the cloud layer. No stars provided reference points. Heavy weather had moved across the region, creating conditions the Japanese preferred complete darkness that conventional fighters couldn't penetrate. The Japanese had chosen this night deliberately. Weather forecasts predicted zero visibility. Their bombers would be invisible, except they weren't invisible to radar. Porter called vectors continuously, heading 035. Altitude 8,000, range 3 miles. His voice remained calm, professional, focused entirely on guiding Smith toward the target. Porter had tracked dozens of contacts. He understood how to read returns, how to predict target movement, how to vector Smith onto an intercept course that would position the P-61 perfectly for an attack run. The SCR-720 radar sent pulses into darkness ahead of the Black Widow. Those pulses traveled at the speed of light, bounced off the Japanese bomber's metal fuselage, and returned to the receiver dish. The system calculated distance based on the time delay between transmission and reception. Range 2 miles, Porter said. Smith activated his own radar scope. The smaller display showed a single bright return directly ahead. The target was flying straight and level, no evasive maneuvers. The bomber crew had no idea Smith was climbing toward them through darkness. Japanese bombers lacked tail warning radar. They had no technological means of detecting pursuing fighters. Tail gunners relied on visual acquisition, actually seeing an attacking aircraft before opening fire. In daylight, that system worked adequately. Gunners could spot fighters approaching from behind, track them visually, and engage with defensive armament. In darkness, visual acquisition was impossible. Tail gunners stared into blackness, seeing nothing, while American night fighters close to firing range guided by radar the Japanese didn't know existed. The technological advantage was overwhelming. Smith could see targets the Japanese couldn't detect. He could approach from any angle without being spotted. He could position his aircraft for optimal firing solutions while enemy crews flew blind. Range 1 mile, Porter said. Smith finally saw the target visually. A dark shape against slightly darker clouds. The bomber's exhaust flames showed as faint orange glows from the engine nutshell's the only visible feature, otherwise complete darkness. The target was a Mitsubishi G4M. Americans called it Betty. Twin Mitsubishi Kasei engines producing 1,850 horsepower each. Maximum speed 270 miles per hour. Crew of 7, bomb load 1,760 pounds. The Betty had one critical weakness that made it vulnerable to night fighters. No self-sealing fuel tanks. The aircraft's designers had prioritized range over survivability. The Betty could fly enormous distances, but a single burst from Smith's cannons would ignite fuel that would consume the entire aircraft in seconds. Japanese bomber crews knew this. They called the G4M the flying lighter because of how quickly it burned after taking hits. But strategic requirements demanded long-range bombers that could reach distant targets. The Japanese accepted the vulnerability as the price of operational range. Smith maneuvered the P-61 into position slightly below the bomber, slightly behind. The 420mm cannons were fixed in the lower fuselage, aimed forward. Smith had to point the entire aircraft at the target. He used the IN-6 gunsight integrated into his instrument panel and illuminated reticle projected on to combining glass that showed exactly where the cannons were aimed. He adjusted position until the Betty sat centered in the reticle. Range for 100 yards, Smith armed the cannons. Each cannon held 200 rounds, 800 rounds total. Approximately 40 seconds of sustained fire if he held the trigger down continuously. But Smith wouldn't need 40 seconds. Night fighter doctrine emphasized short, concentrated bursts. Get close, fire, confirm the kill, move to the next target. Wasting ammunition on a single bomber meant fewer rounds available for remaining targets. 12 bombers were inbound. 800 rounds seemed adequate until you calculated how many rounds each intercept consumed. A 2-second burst fired 48 rounds. That meant approximately 16 bursts available if every shot was perfectly efficient. Reality was never perfectly efficient. Some bursts missed, some targets required multiple attacks. Ammunition vanished faster than calculations suggested. Smith closed to 350 yards. He could see the Betty clearly now, dark silhouette against dark sky, oblivious to the predator stalking from below. He squeezed the trigger. The 4 cannons fired simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming even through the engine noise and the leather helmet Smith wore. 20mm high explosive shells streamed toward the Betty at 2,800 feet per second. Tracers looked like red lines drawn across darkness. Smith fired for 2 seconds exactly. 12 rounds per cannon, 48 shells total. The Betty's right wing exploded. Fuel ignited instantly, burning with a brilliant yellow-orange flame that illuminated clouds below. The bomber rolled right and entered a steep dive, trailing fire and debris. Smith watched it fall. The burning aircraft spiraled through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000. It hit the water 8 miles north of Mindoro, impact marked by a flash of light followed by darkness. 1 bomber destroyed, 11 remaining. But Smith's fuel gauge showed he'd burned through 15% of his fuel. The climb to 8,000 feet had consumed more than anticipated. High power settings drained tanks rapidly. Every minute at maximum climb power cost him 3 minutes of patrol time. The mathematics shifted. Originally, Smith calculated 3 hours of fuel for 3 intercepts. Now he had 2 hours 45 minutes for 11 remaining targets. Porter identified the second contact. Heading 180, altitude 6,000 feet. Range 6 miles, Smith turned south and descended. At the P-61's cruise speed of 280 miles per hour, interception would take approximately 5 minutes. 5 minutes during which the bomber flew closer to Mindoro. Closer to the airfields, closer to completing its mission. 320 miles per hour. The R2800 engines consumed fuel at alarming rates at high power settings. But if he didn't intercept quickly, the bomber would reach the target zone. The bomber might get shot down by friendly fire, or it might release its bombs before being destroyed. Porter called corrections. Smith adjusted heading. The second contact grew stronger on the scope. Range for miles, same vulnerable fuel tanks. Same oblivious crew flying straight toward their target. That reduced Smith's maneuvering room. He needed altitude advantage to dive on targets. Lower altitude meant less flexibility. Smith positioned the P6, 1 below and behind the target. The approach had to be precise. Night fighters relied on surprise absolutely. Once the enemy knew you were there, clean intercepts became chaotic dogfights. Bomber crews took evasive action. Gunners opened fire. What should have been a simple attack became complicated and dangerous. No evasive maneuvers. No indication they knew death was climbing toward them from below. Japanese crews feared the Black Widow when they knew it was hunting them. But fear only worked if they detected it first. Smith centered the target in his gunsight, ranged 350 yards. The right engine caught fire immediately, flames spreading along the wing. The bomber nosed over and dove toward the ocean. Smith watched it fall through 6,000 feet, 5,000, 4,000. It hit the water with an impact visible even from Smith's altitude. A splash of white foam briefly illuminated by burning fuel. 2 bombers destroyed, 10 remaining. He'd burned through 58% of his fuel, destroying 2 bombers. 6 bombers would get through. 6 bombers meant American casualties. Porter had 2 more contacts on his scope, both closer to Mindoro than previous targets. Both at different altitudes, one at 9,000 feet. Smith made a decision instantly. He would take the higher target first. Climbing consumed less fuel than descending rapidly. But the higher target was also farther north. Pursuing it meant allowing the lower bomber to get closer to the airfields. Smith turned north and climbed. The P-61 reached 9,000 feet within minutes, engines roaring at high power settings that drained fuel tanks. Porter locked onto the third contact. But this bomber was different. It was faster than the Bettys. Someone aboard that aircraft knew American night fighters were hunting. The third target was a Nakajima Ki-49 Donryu. Americans called it Helen, faster than the Betty, maximum speed 306 miles per hour. Better defensive armament 57.7mm machine guns covering multiple firing arcs. The tail gunner had a clear field of fire directly behind the aircraft. Even in darkness, a skilled tail gunner could track muzzle flashes and return fire accurately enough to damage the P-61. Smith adjusted his approach. Instead of positioning directly behind the Helen, he came from below and to the left the bomber's blind spot. Most Japanese bombers had poor ventral coverage. The belly was vulnerable because designers prioritized forward and rearward defensive guns over downward-firing weapons. Smith exploited that weakness deliberately. Night fighting wasn't about courage or aggression. It was about understanding enemy aircraft design, identifying vulnerability points, and attacking from angles that minimized risk while maximizing effectiveness. Range decreased to 1 mile. The pilot was experienced. He understood that straight and level flight made his aircraft an easy target. Porter compensated by predicting the bomber's movements. He watched the pattern, anticipated the next turn, and vectored Smith to where the target would be rather than where it currently was. Smith closed to 600 yards. The aircraft responded smoothly to control inputs. Smith kept the bomber centered in his gunsight despite its maneuvering. Range 500 yards, 450, 400. Tracers streamed past Smith's canopy red lines that missed by feet rather than yards. The gunner had spotted the P-61. The element of surprise was gone. Smith had one chance to take the shot before the Helen entered a defensive spiral that would make tracking nearly impossible. He squeezed the trigger. Longer than his previous attacks because the target was maneuvering and he needed to ensure enough shells connected. The 20mm rounds punched through the Helen's fuselage. The right engine exploded in a brilliant flash. The bomber rolled inverted and entered a spin. Smith pulled away hard to avoid debris. 3 bombers destroyed. Below that, any delay headwind, navigation error, combat damage could result in fuel exhaustion before reaching the runway. Running out of fuel over open ocean at night meant certain death. No visual references, no way to judge altitude. The aircraft would hit the water before the pilot realized how low he was flying. Porter had one more contact on his scope. The fourth target, heading 170. Altitude for 1,000 feet. This was the bomber Smith had bypassed earlier, the one flying at low altitude. It was now only 12 miles from Mindoro, close enough that Smith could see searchlights from the American airfield's thin white beams sweeping the sky. Anti-aircraft batteries were ready. Gunners had their fingers on triggers, waiting for targets to appear in range. The P-61 dropped through 8,000 feet, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. The altitude advantage gave him better position for the attack. Range for miles, 3 miles, 2 miles. The pilot either didn't know American night fighters were in the area or didn't care. Japanese bomber crews often accepted death as the price of completing objectives. Crews stayed at their stations even when fire consumed their bombers. Smith positioned the P-61 for the kill. Below and behind, 350 yards. He checked his ammunition counter, 512 rounds remaining. Enough for 3 more attacks, maybe for if he was conservative. If he engaged this bomber and missed, he wouldn't have enough fuel to pursue it again. Smith fired, 2-second burst, 48 rounds. Fire spread across the remaining wing structure. Smith turned the P-61 back toward Mindoro. His fuel gauge showed 21%. McGuire Field was 18 miles south. The Black Widow consumed approximately 100 gallons per hour at cruise speed. Smith had roughly 60 gallons remaining. Unless something went wrong, nothing appeared. The remaining 8 Japanese bombers had turned back. Whether they detected Smith's attacks or simply lost their nerve didn't matter. The mission was accomplished. For kills, 0 American casualties. The airfields were safe. Construction crews would work through the night without interruption. At 0042 hours, Porter detected a new contact. Heading north, range for miles, altitude 7,000 feet. Smith checked his position. He was 12 miles from McGuire Field, fuel at 19%. The contact was between Smith and his base. If it was a Japanese bomber, it was heading toward the airfield Smith had just defended. The alternative was worse, letting a Japanese bomber reach Mindoro unchallenged. Smith had destroyed 4 aircraft. If a 5th bomber got through and killed American personnel, the entire night's work would be tainted. Numbers didn't matter if someone died because Smith prioritized his own survival over mission completion. Smith turned toward the contact. It was a Nakajima Ki-80 for Hyatt. Americans called it Frank, a single-engine fighter. Maximum speed 392 miles per hour. For 12.7mm machine guns to 20mm cannons, one of the best Japanese fighters in service. The Frank was faster than the P-61, more maneuverable, better rate of climb. He was flying blind, searching for American aircraft using visual references that didn't exist in complete darkness. Smith positioned the P-61 below and behind the fighter. Range 500 yards. The approach was identical to his bomber intercepts. Get close, but fighters were smaller targets, harder to hit. And the Frank had armor protection around the cockpit and engine. A 2-second burst might not be enough. Smith closed to 300 yards. His fuel gauge showed 17%. Missing the shot also meant the Frank would know American night fighters were in the area. The element of surprise would be lost. Future intercepts would be more difficult. Smith centered the Frank in his gunsight. Below minimum safety margin. But letting it go meant risking American lives on the ground. The Frank flew straight and level, unaware it was being hunted. 3-second burst, the fighter's engine burst into flames. Black smoke poured from the cowling, the fighter rolled right and dove. The flames grew larger. At 3,000 feet, the pilot ejected. Smith checked his fuel gauge. The engagement had consumed more fuel than calculated. McGuire Field was 11 miles south. The P-61's fuel consumption at cruise speed meant Smith had approximately 22 minutes of flight time remaining, enough to reach the airfield with minimal reserves. But any headwind or navigation error would exhaust his fuel before landing. McGuire Field was on the southwestern coast. The airfield had been operational for only 4 days. Minimal lighting, no instrument landing system. Pilots landing at night relied on a single row of kerosene lamps marking the runway. From 5 miles out, those lamps looked like dim yellow dots. Easy to miss in darkness, Smith descended to 2,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 13%. The P-61's fuel tanks held 646 gallons total. 13% meant 84 gallons remaining. At cruise power settings that provided 18 minutes of flight time, Smith was 8 miles from the airfield. At 280 miles per hour, that meant approximately 1.7 minutes to reach the landing pattern. Enough fuel, barely. The runway was 5,000 feet long crushed coral surface that engineers had completed on December 26th. The same day, the 418th Night Fighter Squadron arrived. The runway was adequate for P-61 operations, but lacked the safety features of established airfields. No overrun area, no crash barriers. If Smith landed too fast or too slow, the aircraft would leave the runway. Smith entered the landing pattern at 1,000 feet. His fuel gauge showed 11%. Engines spooled up during turns, spooled down during descents. Each power change consumed additional fuel. Smith calculated he had approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining. More than enough to land. At 0-0-5-5 hours, something went wrong. Smith was 3 miles from the runway. Altitude 800 feet, airspeed 140 knots. The P-61 would hit the ground before Smith realized how low he was flying. The device measured height above ground by bouncing radio waves off the surface, accurate to within 50 feet. Smith could descend slowly using the altimeter and dead reckoning navigation. The technique was dangerous. Any error in navigation meant landing off the runway. Death. Tacloban on Lady was the nearest alternative, 90 miles northeast. Smith had one option: land at McGuire Field without runway lights. The decision was simple. Smith had survived for intercepts. 5 kills in 55 minutes. He had saved American lives on the ground, protected the airfields, enabled the Lingane Gulf invasion to proceed on schedule. Dying now because of extinguished runway lights would make the entire mission meaningless. His altitude was 600 feet, fuel at 9%, and the darkness below was absolute. The radar altimeter showed 380 feet above ground level. Flying at 120 knots gave Smith a 25-knot safety margin. Porter monitored the radar scope. The coastline of Mindoro showed clearly. Smith used compass heading to navigate. The runway ran north-south. Smith approached from the north. His heading was 180 degrees. If his navigation was accurate, the runway would be directly ahead. If not, he would land in jungle or construction areas or coral reefs. Smith extended the landing gear. 3 green indicator lights confirmed all 3 wheels were down and locked. Main gear under each engine nacelle, nose gear under the forward fuselage. But landing without visual references meant Smith couldn't judge his touchdown point. He might hit too hard, collapse the gear, the aircraft would cartwheel. Smith's fuel gauge showed 7%. The aircraft descended at 300 feet per minute. 150. At 100 feet altitude, Smith reduced power. The descent rate increased to 400 feet per minute, faster than normal, but necessary to reach the ground before his fuel ran out. His hands gripped the control column. His feet rested on the rudder pedals, ready to correct for any deviation. Smith felt the jolt through the airframe, but the landing gear held. The nose wheel touched down 3 seconds later. Smith applied brakes. The P-61 decelerated rapidly. 100 knots. He kept the brakes applied until the P-61 stopped completely. They guided Smith to the parking area. Smith climbed out of the cockpit. 5 kills. He had tracked 5 targets successfully. Without Porter's skill, none of the kills would have been possible. Night fighting was a team effort, pilot and radar operator working in perfect coordination. The ground crew inspected the P-61. Smith had started the mission with 800 rounds, but 0 fuel for pursuing additional targets. Smith provided the information from memory for Mitsubishi G for M Betty bombers, 1 Nakajima Ki-40 9 Helen bomber, 1 Nakajima Ki-80 for Frank fighter. All destroyed between 2357 on December 29th and 0-0-4-6 on December 30th. Total engagement time, 49 minutes. The intelligence officers confirmed the kills through multiple sources. Ground radar had tracked the intercepts. Coast watchers reported seeing aircraft crash into the ocean. Wreckage was visible at first light. For bombers, 1 fighter, all exactly where Smith reported. For kills in 1 night equaled the record for American night fighters, but Smith wasn't finished. On December 30th, 1944, at 14:30 hours, Smith flew his second mission of the day. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had been spotted over Mindoro. Single-engine fighters, faster than bombers. More difficult to intercept. Smith and Porter took off in the same P-61. The aircraft had been refueled and rearmed. 800 rounds of 20mm ammunition, 646 gallons of fuel. At 15:12 hours, Porter detected a contact heading north. Altitude 12,000 feet, range 8 miles. Smith climbed to intercept. The target was another Nakajima Ki-80 for Frank fighter, faster than the P-61 in level flight. But Smith had altitude advantage. He dove on the Frank from above. The diving attack increased his speed to 390 miles per hour. Faster than the Frank's maximum level speed, Smith fired at 400 yards. 2-second burst, 48 rounds. The Frank's engine exploded. The fighter rolled inverted and dove into the ocean. Smith's 7th kill. The final victory made him the top-scoring American night fighter ace of World War II, 7 confirmed kills, all achieved in less than 24 hours of combat flying. No other American night fighter pilot in any theater would match that total. The 418th Night Fighter Squadron continued operations from Mindoro through January 1945. The unit scored 18 total kills during the war, the highest total of any P-61 squadron in the Pacific Theater. Smith's 7 kills accounted for 39% of the squadron's total score. Porter received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his role as radar operator. His skill made every intercept possible. The P-61 times of Waston continued flying combat missions through May 1945. The aircraft survived the war undamaged. After VJ Day, it was scrapped along with most Black Widows. Only for P-61s exist today. None of them is Smith's aircraft, the nose art, the kill markings. The aircraft that hunted for bombers in 80 minutes, all lost to history. McGuire Field supported the Lingane Gulf invasion as planned. American forces landed on January 9, 1945, P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts operating from Mindoro provided air cover. The airfield Smith defended on December 29 enabled that air cover. Engineers estimated that Japanese bombs hitting the construction areas would have delayed airfield completion by 2 weeks. 2 weeks meant the invasion would have been delayed. Casualties would have mounted. The war would have lasted longer. Smith survived the war. He returned to the United States in February 1946, left the military, became a civilian, never sought publicity, never wrote memoirs. The only records of his achievement exist in military archives. Unit histories, intelligence reports, the dry documentation of kills confirmed and missions accomplished. The P-61 Black Widow proved what night fighters could achieve. 700 aircraft built, used in every theater: European, Pacific, China-Burma, India, Mediterranean. The aircraft dominated night combat from 1944 through 1945. After the war, the P-61 was redesignated F-61, continued service until 1954, then retired, replaced by jet-powered night fighters with better performance. But in December 1944, over Mindoro, the Black Widow was the most advanced night fighter in the world. And Carol Smith was the best pilot flying it.